To introduce our new speaker, I will actually start by confessing that the museum library has a huge debt towards him and towards also the co-author of the presentation, Nicole Kearney, because they really helped us structuring our data in BHL. So thank you for that. And so there are Rod Page, who is Professor of Taxonomy at the University of Glasgow, and also Nicole Kearney, who is the manager of BHL Australia. And they will present us how to get to a more visible, more connected, and more useful BHL.
Okay, thanks very much, Clement. So I'm Rod Page, and I am up here. I'm probably going to speak very quickly about a lot of randomly interconnected things. So if it all flashes by, you can find out more on Twitter. I have a blog, and also I run the BioStore project related to BHL. I'm also on Mastodon. How many people are on Mastodon, just out of curiosity? Quite a few. How many people are on Twitter? Yeah, okay, interesting. Okay, and my companion in this bizarre little project, this is Nicole over here. Nicole is also on Twitter. Are you on Mastodon? No, not on Mastodon. Nicole runs BHL Australia, it's also on Twitter, and runs the Persistent Identifier Working Group. Okay, so this slide is sort of a visual abstract of what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk a bit about persistent identifiers, namely DOIs. I'm going to talk a bit about taxonomic databases. I'm going to talk a bit about Wikidata, and then I'm going to finish up talking about ChatGPT. Okay. So why do I care about BHL? I am really interested in finding species descriptions, original descriptions of new species, also where taxonomists maybe change their mind, move them to a different genus, change the name, and so on. And BHL is full of this stuff. And Nicole and I constantly argue about the value of BHL in terms of pretty pictures. One thing I don't think people realize is there's a lot of very modern material in BHL. You will find DNA sequences. You will find all kinds of amazing things in the recent literature in BHL. And here's just a small kind of sample. So I want access to this information. So one goal that we have is simply, in an ideal world, we would link every species on the planet, its original description, to the literature. You could go and find that, because that's the fundamental evidence, as was emphasized in the previous panel. This is the evidence for those species that they exist and what we know about them. So this is what we'd like. And ideally, I would like it in a particular form. So I would like to have a persistent identifier for the taxon name and a persistent identifier for the literature. Obvious candidate would be a DOI. So this is what we want. Now, it turns out, if you get to try and sort of get a sense of where we are, this is a little study that Nicole and I did last year on the catalogue of life. This is essentially the sort of collection of all the names for the species that most of these species are currently alive. So there's something like 2 million species, and within that database there are about 1.29 million references. That's bibliographic citations. Now, it turns out that's only 66% of the names. So really, about 40% of the names have no mention of literature at all. And then if you sort of find out, okay, so what are those things? The vast majority of them are simply text strings. That is, people have cited some bit of random text. A few of those, if we're lucky, have some sort of identifier. Most cases a URL, and a very tiny percentage, way down here, less than 1%, just over 1%, have a DOI. So for the 21st century, this is insane. So basically we're saying the vast majority of species are not linked to a digital place you can go and find more about that species. That is just crazy. So we want to fix that. And we think, it's not that the DOIs don't exist. Some work that I've sort of done, ballpark figure, I think probably about a quarter of the species on the planet, there actually is a DOI for the publication. We just haven't linked them yet. So how are we going to do this? So what I want to sort of run through is some various approaches to doing this. So the first approach is, maybe we can do this linking, and once we've done the linking, go and talk to taxonomic databases and say, here are all these wonderful links to DOIs and to BHL. Would you like to have them? We'll talk about how that worked out. Maybe we could go to GBIF and provide this information to GBIF. And I want to sort of finish this little section talking about a really cool project called Checklist Bank, which we're sort of hoping is going to give us a way forward. So the first approach that Nicole and I did was we do this linking. So we take taxonomic names, link them to the literature, either in BHL or DOIs, or ideally both. And what we sort of discovered is that most databases said, well, that's kind of nice. We can't do anything with that. It may be the case that they don't have the resources to add those links. It's not on their kind of roadmap. It's not a top priority for them. Or their database is not designed in a way that they can do that. Or if they take the links, there's no way for them to change their website that they can actually display these, which means, why is the point of doing it? So this became essentially an exercise in frustration. So Nicole and I had done all this work, and we couldn't actually see it sort of displayed anywhere. Now, it's not that the databases necessarily intend to be a roadblock, but it kind of, in many cases, they kind of are. They just don't have the resources to do it. So this is sort of frustrating. So we thought maybe we could do sort of an end run around these databases. So the second approach was maybe what we need to do is to take these links and give them to somewhere like GBIF, which is, as hopefully most of you will come across, GBIF is probably the single largest database of biodiversity information that we have. So we did a little experiment where we could put information about names linked to BHL into GBIF. Now, I sort of already exposed the punchline, but we did this, and as I hope I'll show you, it didn't really work terribly well. So here's what we did. This is a species description that's in BHL, and essentially you've got a bit of text, scientific name, and a pretty picture. So essentially what we did is we took that page image and put that in GBIF, and we took the OCR text for that page there, put it in, we tweeted about it, obviously, we celebrated, we thought this was great. So this is giving GBIF information on a scientific name linked to the literature, and you can go and see it. Now, when we then went to GBIF, so the picture on the left is how GBIF displays that. So you get our picture, kind of small, but kind of sort of weak and anemic, and there's a bunch of OCR text from that page. What GBIF does is it kind of then takes all this information it gets from different sources on species and comes up with its own kind of overall view, which is the view on the right. Now our picture's gone, so BHL's picture's vanished. We've still got some OCR text, and that's about it. So that's not great. The other problem is most users going to GBIF probably aren't really going there for taxonomic names. You want to get distributional data. Where in the world is the species found? And we're not giving GBIF any of that. So this is actually really easy to do. We could do this for millions of names, but the output doesn't seem to be terribly useful. Okay, so the third way. The sort of approach we're sort of exploring now is there's a project called Checklist Bank, yet another biodiversity informatics project, like we didn't have enough already, but the motivation behind this is it's a bit like GBIF but for taxonomic names. So the catalogue of life, which I showed you earlier, their kind of approach is let's get all sorts of different databases. I mean, FishBase we heard about is part of the catalogue of life. They will put their data into Checklist Bank. Some of those data sets are blessed and considered to be important. They go into the catalogue of life. But you can put all sorts of other data sets in there as well. So our approach is essentially, let's get a taxonomic database of interest, do the work to make the links between the names and the literature, put that in Checklist Bank. Now we can then use that for our work, but also if that original taxonomic database is ready to use those links, we've got that information there for them already. So in a sense, we've kind of decoupled waiting for the taxonomic database to be ready to display the links to saying, we've got that information, here it is, it's available, it's ready for you if you want it, but we can also use it. So now that it's in Checklist Bank, we can start to do some things. We can actually start to make some applications based on that. So this one that I want to show you now. This is a little toy that I built last year. It's called Species Site. So if you've ever had any dealings with taxonomists, they will complain endlessly that they are not cited. And one challenge, though, is if you say, okay, so where are the citations to your taxonomic names, they can't actually tell them. They can't give them to us in many cases. What this does here is it takes these mappings, you put in a taxonomic name, and it gives you back a full citation for that particular publication, ideally with an identifier, a DOI, perhaps a Wikidata item like this one here, and if you're super lucky, a link to the PDF. So the goal would be, for every species name on the planet, you put it in, we'll tell you where that name was published, full citation, and you can actually go and read it. So that would be our sort of wonderful kind of goal. Okay, so that's taxonomic names and linking them to literature. The next thing I want to touch on is Wikidata, which has already sort of come up. So I'm assuming most of us have heard of Wikidata. It's essentially a sort of structured database. It's going to provide data to underpin all the Wikipedias. Now, Wikidata is kind of being taken over in some ways by people interested in bibliographic information. The bulk of the data currently in Wikidata is about publications. So there's a great deal of interest in saying, okay, can we have the entire academic literature in Wikidata? And of course, biodiversity is part of that. So one goal would be, can we put the entire sort of biodiversity literature into Wikidata? Now, there's a number of reasons for doing this. And I just want to touch on two of them. One is there is a huge community of people engaged with Wikidata. So you benefit from people interested in editing bibliographic data. And also you become part of the sort of larger knowledge graph. So Wikidata is full of information on species, also people, places, publications, localities, all kinds of things. So this idea of having stuff linked together, you can sort of almost like try it out and see what it's going to look like when this sort of wonderful event happens. Now, I'm going to show you a diagram, and it's one of these diagrams that I have to explain at first. So it's probably a pretty silly diagram. What I'm trying to do is show you the sort of scale of editing in Wikidata. So what this diagram is going to show you is I want you to imagine every time a record is created in, say, a database, in this case Wikidata, we're going to plot, okay, it's been created, and then we're going to sort of see if anything happens to it. So the diagram you're going to see is basically each one of these represents the creation of a record. Anything that appears to the right of it is when that record is being edited. So if every sort of thing here just is along that diagonal, this is the kind of database where somebody enters the data and it never gets touched. Nobody looks at it, nobody cares about it, it just sits there. If there's ever something along on the right-hand side, somebody's come along and looked at it and tweaked it a bit. So our question is, what does data look like in Wikidata? So what you're seeing here is this kind of diagram. So everything along that diagonal there is the original creation of an item in Wikidata. These are all publications. And what you can see is this kind of diagonal here is just full of things. So these are people coming along and editing. Maybe they're linking a publication to an author. Maybe they're adding an additional identifier. Maybe they're adding a tag in a different language. There's a huge community of people actively contributing and editing your data. And I think this is probably, you're not going to get this from any other kind of community at this kind of scale. This fact that people are coming along. I mean, I've had records that I've uploaded. There's been somebody who's interested, say, in Polish academics. So they don't care about biodiversity, but they'll see some of these papers. If it's by a Polish person, they will go in there and edit it and tweak it. So you sort of engage with a much larger kind of potential community of people using Wikidata. There's another aspect to Wikidata that I kind of enjoy, is it's kind of like this idea of the knowledge graph. Things are connected. So what I'm going to show you now is, this is a little website that I built that queries Wikidata to sort of display it in sort of different kind of ways. If anybody's actually used Wikidata, by itself it's kind of boring. It's basically just a website, you put in information. I know some of us kind of geek out and sort of putting information in, but you don't really get to see how it's connected. So this is a website, it's called A List of Everything Cool. My son is called Alec. I was just desperately trying to come up with some way to use his name. It's a terrible acronym, but it'll have to do. So what I'm going to do is just show you some screenshots of this to give you a sense of how things look once they're kind of interconnected. So you can display journals. This is not, sadly, a BHL journal, but it's a journal that's freely available online. This is just summarizing, here's a journal, here are the publications, these are the articles, they've got thumbnails because the PDFs are freely available, and you can get a sense of, here's some cool kind of issues, some articles in this journal. Some journals have a very complicated history. This is one from the Paris Museum. Clement probably recognizes this. This is Adansonia. There have been several Adansonias. The journal has split, regrouped, split again, and so on. Wikidata is great for this. You can record the entire history of a particular journal, when it split, when it merged, and so on. So, and below all that would be a list of all the articles in this journal. There are lots of relationships between articles. We're obviously, I guess, familiar with citation, but there are other relationships. This is showing you an article that's been published twice, once in Russian and once in English. Both are treated as separate articles, they've got different DOIs. So you can have links between articles in all sorts of different kind of ways. Now this is, you can have people obviously in Wikidata. One of the saddest activities I am engaged with is updating taxonomist entries in Wikidata, particularly when they die. Those even the Smithsonian will no doubt recognize Vicky Funk. And what you can do is you can link, in this case, Vicky to her publications, but also to obituaries and papers that describe her and so on. So all this kind of information can all kind of be combined in sort of one big kind of place where you can kind of navigate it and explore it. And finally, since we're interested in biodiversity, this is a view of a New Zealand cicada species. Got a whole bunch of different species there. And again, being Wikidata, these are publications about those species. So Wikidata is kind of a wonderful kind of playground of interconnection. You can see all the kind of connections between these different things. So based on that, I think obviously BHL should be engaging with Wikidata as it is, and some of you may have already seen this enormous document that JJ has shepherded into being. So how do we get this information from BHL into Wikidata? There's a couple of ways to do this. So these are a couple of little websites that I put together. There are other ways to do this. I have a habit of making little quick and dirty little tools just to sort of have a play. This is one that if you have a DOI, you can put it into this website and upload it to Wikidata. It has a few special tweaks for BHL. If there are information on the BHL creator, you can actually link it to an entry for a person in Wikidata rather than just a name. We have tools for adding citations. What you're seeing here is one particular paper and all the other things in a Wikidata that it cites. So you start to build up a citation graph. Now you won't see much of this for a BHL paper because BHL doesn't yet publish citation information, but some of the things that are cited may well be in BHL. So BHL content is sort of starting to be linked in that way through Wikidata. And lastly, this is another tool. One of the great challenges, of course, we've seen already discussed, authors. We have so many authors represented by simple text strings. How do we link those to actual people? This again is another quick and dirty tool for doing that. Okay, so Wikidata, until I guess a few months ago, Wikidata was a new hotness. It was really, really cool. And then along came ChatGPT, which kind of has changed everything. So what I want to do to finish up with is just give you a sense, I think, of some of the possibilities that this tool or tools like it offer. So I don't pretend to explain what ChatGPT is. We're just going to mumble some acronyms. It's artificial intelligence. It uses large language models. Don't ask anything more. But what I want to do is just give you some examples of what it can do. So one of the first things is ChatGPT can take unstructured information and make it structured. If you work with bibliographic data, you may well do what I do, which is spend a lot of time trying to take a text string and convert it to structured information that you can put in a database. And I've written parsers to do this. People have spent, lifetimes, decades, PhD theses doing this. You paste it into ChatGPT and click go, and out it comes. This is 2 text strings up here. ChatGPT, I've asked it to format them in BibTeX. It's a horrible format, but you can kind of fit it on a slide. And it's done things like it's actually filled out the journal name. It was abbreviated up here, it filled it out. I didn't tell it that, it just did it. That's kind of fun. So maybe we don't need to do bibliographic parsing anymore. Whoa. Back. So bibliographic data is fairly straightforward. We've already had some discussion about specimen records, and Richard talked a bit about this. This is a plant record, and basically I've taken it out of paper, I've given it to ChatGPT, I've asked it to parse it and output it in a format called Darwin Core, which is for GBIF. And basically it just did a pretty good attempt. We could more or less take that information there and stick it into GBIF, just like that. So again, it hasn't been taught anything, it just kind of did it. So this is kind of potentially promising. All that kind of rich specimen data, which at the moment, for example, BHL can't deliver to GBIF, maybe we could start doing it using this kind of approach. OCR. So one of the classic problems with BHL is it's not born digital literature, for the most part. We've got page scans, we convert it to text. What you're seeing here on the left is a page image, the right, the OCR text in BHL, and I flagged most of the cases where it's gone wrong. Notice in particular, that's the scientific name of a frog. We humans can read that, computer, not so much. So, put that into ChatGPT, and no surprise, out comes a text, looking pretty good. There are a couple of things still kind of wrong, but it's got the name of that frog completely correct. So there's also a potential here, and this is probably actually in some ways probably the best use, the obvious use case for ChatGPT, because all it's about predicting the next word you would get in a sequence. So I think there's a lot of potential there. It's not always going to work, and I know Mike has experimented with it a bit, but the potential is there. Imagine being able to automatically correct OCR text at scale. And the final example I just want to show you is, so I'm really interested in trying to summarize information about species. And a few years ago, I wrote a little website called iSpecies. And it would take snippets of text from different Wikipedias. And they'd be in different languages, and I'd just display the whole lot of them. So what you're seeing here is, I've asked a whole bunch of Wikipedias to tell me something about Dendrophithora. And I've got information back in Swedish, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And I can barely read English, the rest of them I can't. But what I did is I just basically said to ChatGPT, okay, read all that stuff and summarize it in English. And it's given me back this block of text here about this plant, and it's taken information from all the different languages and summarized them here in English, even if the English summary, which is just there, it's quite short, doesn't mention any of that stuff. So now here's a potential to start to summarize information. So again, imagine taking text from BHL and summarizing articles, which people are already doing for the wider kind of literature. But the sort of potential to say, what does BHL tell me about this species? Summarize it. I haven't tried to do the reverse, like write that in Swedish or French. That could be kind of interesting as well. So I think there's enormous potential here. So if you learn nothing else from this talk, just go and have a play with ChatGPT. And once you get past the moral panic of, oh God, students are going to cheat at exams, there's an extraordinary kind of potential here. So just to sort of summarize, so we started off with persistent identifiers and DOIs in particular. There's a lot of interest in trying to add more and more DOIs to BHL literature so we can link those to taxonomic names. This has been a bit of a challenge. I think Nicole and I have kind of figured out a strategy that will enable us to sort of do this linking, make it available for people, both for anybody who wants to use it, but also the original taxonomic databases can come and get it when and if they're ready. Wikidata, it's obviously going to be really kind of important. I think it's a great playground for exploring connected knowledge. We'd like to get as much of BHL into it as possible and link to as much stuff as we can possibly do. And lastly, ChatGPT. I know it's there's a huge amount of hype, a huge amount of buzz, but I think there's some incredible potential there to sort of use it to kind of at least make some progress on the kind of challenges that we face. Thanks for your time.